What's up? Just refreshing some of my pages here. Okay, looks like I'm live. Hey everyone. I'm gonna wait a minute to get started. It's 1 o'clock now, 1 o'clock Austin time. I didn't do anything at all on this project since the last live stream. So to recap, on Monday I just opened a new builder project, started building out some of the stuff from no code list. So you can see on the screen, I've got a logo and a menu laid out and 2 columns here, but really there's not much that's built. So today what I'm gonna do, first I'm gonna answer a question that I got yesterday or maybe later on Monday. And then I'm gonna set up a list on the page and send everything into the list. So the cards that are the actual no-code list, each card is a tool. I'll set up the list element and show how to send data into a list, repeat a page, that kind of thing, which is a pretty core builder concept. And then I'll actually style those cards to match the actual style on the page here on the current live site. And I think in the process of doing all that, I'll take care of this font because last time it didn't seem to load the font. And I use fonts all the time, so I'm sure who knows what I did, but I'll fix that possibly too today if I can. So, and then after that, if there's time, I think all that said, that'll take like an hour, but if there's time after that, then I will start pulling in real Airtable data, which consists of first pulling an Airtable pattern into Builder. So I built this pattern separately that's shareable. I pull the pattern in, which gives me a bunch of Builder native Airtable actions. And then pulling the actual data in from my Airtable base is a matter of setting an API key, selecting the table I want, etc. So it's really easy after that point. But honestly, I don't think we'll get there today because I just feel like it went faster than I thought last time. All right, so the first things first, let's start with, I'm going to answer a question from Alex, who asked me about hover states. And I have a blank project here. I just created new and haven't touched it since. But basically what I'll do is I'll kind of explain a little bit about how the hover states work in the first place. And then I'll also talk about how, which hover states override other hover states, depending on the type of class you're using, and which hover states override, other default states. So I'm just gonna put something simple in here, like some text probably. And we'll just say this is hover demo. So on here, this is a text box. It could be literally any HTML element or any element in Builder. You can add styles to, and the way that you add a hover state, so when your mouse hovers over something and it changes, that's CSS. That's just a style. So you can do it to literally any element on your page. And so this for this demo, actually, well, I'll probably just remove this. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't do much. It's going to change the font maybe. All right, so this is a text box with nothing on it, and we have primary style class, utility style classes, and inline properties, and external class reference, which is a separate thing. It's way less often used, but I can describe that too. So primary style class, the way I think about that from a code perspective is it's almost more like adding a class to an element directly, like adding styles to a P or adding styles to an A, in HTML. But what it really is it's a main style class that is sort of like the base. So if you put a primary style class onto an element, it gets all those properties, of course, all those CSS properties, but everything else is going to override that primary style class. So usually they're pretty base level stuff. So if you wanted every paragraph or every P tag on your site to be yellow, you could set primary style class to be yellow for that. And then if you want to override that in certain areas later, certain elements, you do that. But, like as a base, that's what you'd want. And you wouldn't necessarily make 2 very identical base style classes and maintain them separately. It's kind of like where you put your core styles. But again, like everything in Builder, it's preference how you use it. So you could use it however you want. And then utilities, and there's only one of those. There's one primary style class in Builder. That is Builder specific. Usually when I talk, things are, like I'm talking about CSS. I'm not really talking about Builder. This is Builder, where you get that one primary style class. And then you can have as many utility style classes as you want on top of that. And the utility styles overwrite the primary styles. And so the one concept from CSS that applies here is that it's almost like you wrote the primary style class at the beginning of your CSS style sheet, and then the utility class comes after. It'll always overwrite it. So no matter what order your classes are in your HTML, they inherit and do things because of CSS rules. This is like just a way of saying primary is base, utility goes on top. And you can put as many utility classes on an element as you want. Like you can put literally like 17 of them. And the way that they override each other is a little tricky. So like you can get really confused if you have too many in there and you're trying to do too much. But basically they override each other in a strange way. But I happen to know behind the scenes how it works, how it actually lays the styles into the CSS sheet. But for all intents and purposes, you wouldn't really want to rely on the orders of these utilities. Really what you want to do is that they override the primary style class. And if anyone has questions on that, I can explain literally what that is. I feel like it'd be a little boring for right now, but I'd be happy to explain why that functions the way it does. And I use it to my advantage. Like I know how to use multiple utility classes, and which is going to override because I know how it's set up. So it could be helpful. But forget that for now. For inline styles, that's the last one of these three here, these three main things. Inline styles overwrite utility styles and primary styles. And the inline styles it's literally inline CSS. Like if you know HTML, or if you know HTML and CSS, that's like having an HTML tag and writing style equals and writing those style properties out in the HTML, which if you do know how that works, you know that overwrites anything. Like that style is the style. And any classes that you have, if you have a same property, which I'll go into the properties next, but if you have the same property on a primary and you change it in the inline will always win out. So that's really good for like custom stuff. Like if you have, this one element, you want to put a margin top on it, but you don't need a class. It's not repeated anywhere. You just want to do it once. That's where inline comes in handy. And I think I mentioned last time, but a lot of times what I do is when I'm building, especially if I'm kind of designing and building at the same time, I'll just load up these inline styles because it's so fast without worrying about making a class, style everything, and then when it's done, pull those styles into a class. But for now, just know that inline overwrites utility overwrites primary. And then this last one I'll touch briefly, but that's external class references, which is like if you have, you can actually include a third-party style sheet in Builder. There's a whole thing called page headers, and page headers is just like a chunk of code that goes in the page header. So like the fonts is a page header. You can see it's just this link. I mean, it doesn't have to be set up like this. Actually, you can do a lot of things in Builder natively through Builder. But I found that one thing is if you ever need to do something really out of the ordinary, really custom, 99% of the time you can come into page headers here, pop some code. It puts it in the head tag of the HTML. And you like choose, like this one loads on all pages, but you actually can choose which pages these fire on, that kind of thing. So if you did put a like a bootstrap CSS reference, or if you have another site with CSS on it and you put the like a reference.css file, that's gonna have classes in it, and the classes are gonna be named however you name them. So you could actually add a class name here. And so if I had a say bootstrap CSS loaded in, and there was a class in there to make this blue, and I knew the name, I could just type that name in there. That's a little bit of a way to make Builder work more seamlessly with outside stuff. I don't really ever use external class references. Like if you're building in Builder, you don't really need it because all your styles are in Builder already. All right, so then that's the concept of the inheritance, the hierarchy of how these things kind of like override each other. But within each, you have styles. Oops. So I'm just going to add like a new primary demo class, I'll call it. And this primary demo class, to illustrate, I'll just add like, let's just add color blue. And you can see it turned blue here. And also, quick tangent, I'm in used props here. If you're watching this and you're new to CSS and you're like, oh, I have to know what property I want every time, which is what I do. Since I basically know the properties, I always do it this way. You don't have to do that. You can actually have this all properties view down here, which is a GUI, a graphical user interface for every CSS property. So if you drop this down, you know, it's all visual. And this used prop section is visual too, for the most part, but not always. And you have to like choose what you want first. For me, this is a lot faster because I always know what styles I want. And actually, the fastest way might be to come into the CSS and just type it. As someone who types CSS, you know, for the last 15 years, I've actually found that I much prefer to do this hybrid here where I'm doing used props, I'm popping them in, and then I usually just type manual values, but that's me. Anyway, so we got primary demo as the primary style class. It's got the color blue style. So now we're going to add a utility class. And like I said, the utility overrides primary. But the way that it overwrites it is style by style, right? So if I did like a text transform here of uppercase, see I made this all capital? That's on the utility class, but it's affecting this primary class because this primary class has no text transform property. So the utility class will show. However, if I did like color green, see that changed to green because this green does overwrite this color blue. And in the same way, if this would have had a text transform on it, I don't think I've ever typed anything besides text transform uppercase. If this has this, you can see it did not affect it because this utility is overwriting it. So if I remove this one, it goes back down to lowercase. And you can do that same thing with inline too. So like I have, it's blue, then the utility is making it green. I can put an inline style to make it red, and that will override there. And so that's general CSS kind of concepts and how they apply to Builder. And then the next step in the question is this hover state. So when you're in a class or a style, they're called classes. Classes like the label that you put on a group of styles. So if I confuse those terms, I apologize. Sometimes I interchange them. So yeah, so if you have primary demo and you want to add a hover state, you have these states here. You have default, hover, disabled, and then you can actually add any state you want. Like you can just type a state name. So you can do things that are out of the ordinary in HTML even if you want. For this though, we're talking hover. So if I click hover, all that's here is a selector. This is the class that we're on. That's the ID that it actually uses, and it's showing hover. This is actually a CSS property, but just keep this here. Just ignore it basically. You know you're on the hover. And here, if we wanted to say on hover, let's make the background color pink, right? And this is on the primary style class, remember? So now if I hover, that background class is pink. If I put a hover on the utility class, it will, in the same way as the main styles, will overwrite that primary class. So it's hard to think of color names. So now that's purple, now that's purple. And then same thing with inline, but actually no, you know what? Not same thing with inline. So a little quirk, but this would be logical if you know CSS, is there is no hover state on inline. There's no hover, there's no disable, there's no focus. That's an actual CSS, like CSS file or CSS block thing. It's not like a inline style thing you can even do in HTML. So you don't actually have to worry about it there. The only other thing to mention then would be if you have a hover on the utility class, but you have no hover on the primary class, I don't know if actually this is necessary to even add now that I say this, but it'll show the utility classes hover, which it would anyway because it overrides it. So yeah, that's generally how it works. And Alex, in your question, you talked about how like maybe it was something else was going on because it wasn't behaving as you expected. And I would just add at the end of this that the quirks of CSS, like you never know what's randomly overriding something else. So it's so easy to have confusion, especially, there's confusion in regular CSS, then you're taking it to this next level where you're doing states. So it's very easy that there's some confusion, but hopefully this cleared up the base level of how it should work. And then, if that didn't clear it up, let me know and I'd be happy to talk more about it or next time or even later this time. But yeah, I think that's good for now on the hovers. I'm trying to think if I covered everything I wanted to cover. I think so. So let's move into no code lists now. This is where we were. This is where I left it in the studio. It looks like this on the front end. Logo, menu, without the fonts, search started, and then this categories column and a software list column. I'm just going to refresh this since I haven't in a couple days. And then let's see, let's start. So I want to pull in these cards in a list. Maybe I'll just start there and then we'll go into more design stuff after that. The list stuff itself is pretty straightforward, but it's an important concept because in web applications, this doesn't happen as much in websites or other things, but in web applications, you're doing a lot of listing things where you're kind of like, you might be pulling values from a database and putting cards on a page or putting list rows on a page, and each row represents a different row in the database. It's just a very common setup. And then each of those rows needs like its own actions within it and that kind of thing. And so the way Builder handles all this is through pages. Really, the way Builder handles a lot of stuff is through separate pages. So what I can do is I can create a new page, and then I can put an element on this main page that will not only list multiple of that other page, but it will also bind to data in the database, or what we're going to do is we're going to bind to Airtable data, and it will list those elements based on that data, and it will give each element, each page, context for that data. So it's really cool, but it's easier if I show it than tell it. So let me start by creating a new page on here. And this page is like, it's like a card. I'm going to call it card, but this is like one software. And the actual content on the page is going to be all dynamic, all variable based. So what I'm going to do is I'll create this card page. And I'm going to put, let's see. I'm going to start it with just a container for now. And if you remember from last time, I'm just going to go in and remove that class. So I've got a container here with nothing on it. Oh, whoops. With nothing on it. And it's going to become my card. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give it a primary style class of card. And you can be as descriptive or not descriptive as you want. And like I mentioned, you can always change that name later. But in this case, because I've built no-code lists before, I actually know that wherever these cards are used, it's always the same card. And it's just the card. It's like the card. So I'm just calling it card. And then, yeah, so I'm gonna do a couple things. I'm going to put something, just like a dummy thing in here. And then I'm going to put in the list and populate so we can see how that list works. But then after that, I'm going to go pull the exact styles and match the styles to here. So in order to just like see it, I'm going to put, let's see what I should put. I'll do a heading on here. And then I'm going to put just like some kind of a width or something. Actually, I don't need to do a width, so I'll be good on this heading. So this would be like the software name, basically. All right, so for now, I'm good on that page. We're going to come back and do more to it, but I just needed this page to be here. And sometimes it helps. Oh, I created two of them because I press enter. Sometimes it helps. I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something that helped, but whatever. All right, so got this card here. So I want to insert them under this heading here, which is on this right side. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get an element. We have these two elements, list of rows and list of cards. And then you can see next to them, there's actually an element for a list row, which is kind of a symbol. It's got like a bunch of elements in it, and an element for a list card. And so you can use these together. You can kind of see how that works. The list of rows, you would insert a list row on the page. But what I did is I made a custom page. So I'm going to insert this list of cards here. I'm just going to drop it into this container. So it comes up here. And right now it's blank. I mean, you can see it says go to child page. It's referencing this child page. So I click this. It's going to, oh, maybe. Oh, I didn't set it to the child page. Sorry about that. See if I can find my, oh my gosh, it's crazy. I think it just like took me out of everything. Let me refresh. Sorry about that. I clicked to go to a page that didn't exist because what I was going to do in the next step is actually select the page that list of cards is going to use. I'm sure it'll come back here. Yeah. All right. So home, main. All right, so that's my list of cards. If I would have dropped it on the page, it would have forced me to select a page, which is why I forgot that I didn't. But what I can do is on the properties of this list of cards, and remember each element, each different type of element gets a different set of properties. There's one called row page here. And so this list of cards or list of rows, I select a page to represent each row. I'm going to select this card page. So I select card. And now you can see right here, sort of, you can see that there's cards. There's cards here. Software name is 1, software name is 2, software name is 3. There's 3 of them in here. And the reason they're all jammed together like that is because I have this page over here with a container and a heading in it. So what it is in HTML is it's a div with no styles and a heading. And so if you, well, it's a little more complicated because this container has a thing that puts them side by side. But, you know, if you put 3 divs in with no styling, this is what they look like. There's no padding. There's no nothing. The reason that it's doing that is this list of cards comes with a class called list of cards outer. And so you can see on this class, we have display flexbox, display flex, I should say, which makes it flexbox. There's a flex direction property, a flex wrap property. There's a width and a max width. There's all these things on here. And like other times, I don't want any of them. So I'm just going to remove that for right now. Especially if you don't know CSS well, like you should definitely just use that. I mean, this is a very useful element out of the box. What I'm going to do is actually convert it to CSS grid instead of flexbox because I prefer that. So it's just a little different for me. But you can see when I remove that class, it did stack these, which is like default HTML behavior. Div, 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 block level elements. The other thing, if you're really savvy, you might notice is that there's padding on the left side here, which if you know HTML would kind of clue you in that this list of cards is made up of a UL element with LI elements inside of it. And the UL in HTML has this default padding in here because it's a list. It's like an indent. So anyway, let's see. I'm going to add, wait, let me see. There's a chat. That's a bug. Let me just ask what's the bug. So let's see. So I'm going to add a class for, let's call this is basically all my cards. So what I can do here is I can add a generic class for a list of cards that's a grid. You know, because I might, if I have lots of lists of cards on my page and I always want to do them the same way, I might add a class here called like list of cards grid, whereas the default one was list of cards outer. But I'm actually, instead, I'm going to make this class specific to these cards, which are used on a couple pages, but they're always the same. So this is actually like a list of cards. Oh, good. Okay. So let's see. So I'm going to call this class cards with an S. I recognize this is slightly confusing and maybe I wouldn't recommend, especially if you're just starting out, but like I have this habit where I call groups of things the plural and then the actual items the singular. So for me, this makes sense where this whole group would be cards class and then each card is card with no S. But if those are too similar and that might confuse you later, don't do that. So one thing I'll do here is set up a few kind of like housekeeping, I would call it, like resets. So I mentioned that padding that comes by default. Just set that to 0. And then from now, just so there's nothing crazy on here, I'll set the margin to 0. Sometimes in HTML, I don't think ULs actually have this, but sometimes in HTML, things have margin. Like a p tag has default margin. So if you know you don't want it, you can just set it to 0. And honestly, that might change depending on what we do. Margin auto is I use a lot, so that might change later. All right, so you can see it's fits the space better, but it's still listing these big. They're not like cards; they're like rows. So that's where I'm going to add display. Whoops. Display and then grid. Now, out of the box, display grid doesn't actually do too much. You can see I remove the space in between each of those, but out of the box, it's almost like just like a setup. So now the next step is a property grid template columns. So when you make something display grid, then you can edit a couple other properties that only apply if you have a display grid. So grid template columns is how I set up the column layout, and I touched on this last time too. But in this case, I want, well, this view you can't tell, but the biggest view of this, like on the desktop, is like this. So it's 3 across, and no matter how big it gets, 3 across is the max. So when it comes to responsive, some people do mobile first responsive, or they would set this up as 1 and then change it as the screen gets bigger. I do the opposite, just kind of like old habits, but I do desktop size first and then responsive as it goes down. So I'm trying to do this desktop size here, and I know that with CSS grid, I can do 1 fractional unit fr space 1 fractional unit space 1 fractional unit, and that does 1, 2, 3. And what it kind of means is like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That fractional unit divides the available space evenly. So you can do different things if you wanted to. Like I could do like 2 fractional units for 1, and you can see this one now is like 2 units. Like if you split it evenly, that becomes 1 unit, and these are 1. So you can do a lot of stuff in there, but I know for this I want it 1. And then I know also that and I won't do this now, but for responsive, when I change these, all I'm going to do is change, when the screen gets a little smaller, I'll change it to just 1 FR, 1 FR, 2 side by side. When it gets all the way small, I'll just do 1 FR, and I'll just stack these. And the screen size I have here, you can see it's already stacking to 2. And yeah, if I made it smaller, it would stack to 1. So that's good. Only now they're butting up against each other. And so I could do a couple things here. I can use a margin on this card where I basically like this. If you imagine a grid here, the divider line would be here, and there's no space between each element, but there's margin on the card, so you'd see a space. Or there's actually a grid property for column gap, and row gap in this case, because I'm doing rows too. So that's actually what I'm going to change. And that way I don't have to mess with margin at all on this card. My goal basically, not goal, but kind of like secret underlying goal that's not that important, is I'm just putting as minimal styles as possible on this card. So it's easier for me to add it to a universal thing here than jam this up. That's all. So let me get back here real quick and add that in. So we've got display grid template columns with the 1 FRs, and then I think it's called grid column gap actually. Yeah, grid column gap. And this is where, if you didn't know that style, if you're on all props, you could find it listed, or you might just have to Google CSS column gap, and when you do, you'll see grid column gap, and you just type it into this. You start typing it into this and it'll pop up for you. Anyway, I don't know. So these are not set up with grid, I don't think. So when I go to check this gap, it might be tricky, but I'm going to see if I can find what that gap is. Looks like a 1 rem margin on both. So it's going to be a 2 rem gap, I think. And so let me just write that. You can see it. Oh, they're white right now because of that background. So I mentioned this before too, but you can see that yellow background color went away. Just a small in-studio bug. It's still there on this page. This page might not show any cards right now yet though, because I have to put that. So you can't really see, but there's definitely a space in between here. Actually, I'll just show you live. It's important. So take this, and what I'm going to do right here is a little bit, where is this? A little bit abnormal maybe. You don't always need to mess with that, but I'll show you what I just did in a second. All right, cool. So yeah, so I can see now I've got the column gap in here, and on this no code list, like I noticed this when I hovered over, there's a gap, there's a space around the entire outside. And this is another reason not to use margin on the card, right? On this one, I use margin on the card. So I have an even 1em space around the whole thing. But what that means is on the left side here, this doesn't line up with this, right? But there's no way for me to handle that. I mean, I could actually, you can do things in CSS to handle that, but it gets really complex because it would be easy for me to say, okay, on the first one, margin left 0, but I don't know which one's the third one, which one's the second one. I don't know, depending on the layout and the way that these switch 3s and 2s and 1s, I don't know when to tell it to have 0 margin. And the same thing with this side, it's probably not lined up on this side, or it's definitely not lined up on that side too. But CSS grid is cool because I added that gap. It only does it in the gaps. It doesn't do it on the end. And so no matter how many rows I have, it'll make it look much nicer. So that's a nice little bonus. And then before I move on, I can just show you really quickly what I did here too. On the properties of the list of cards, there's one property for default data, and there's one property for data to display in editor. Default data is like the default data that's on the page when someone views it. Data to display in editor is the default data in here in the studio when I'm viewing it. And the way that these lists work, most of the time, not all the time, but like 99% of the time, you're going to pull in data into these lists. So for this, I'm going to pull in Airtable data later. Other times, or a lot of times, you're going to pull in data from a builder collection. And when you pull in that data, it comes in behind the scenes. You don't have to know this, but it comes in as JSON, key value pairs written in JSON. And the list element knows how to read and interpret that JSON. That's how it works. So when this says data to display in editor, and it's 2 regular brackets, and inside of that there's a curly bracket, open and close, comma, curly bracket, comma, curly bracket. Those are representing objects. Each curly bracket is actually a row. So I could do something like this, and then we get a bunch of rows. And in these are representing JSON. So in these I could actually have properties like this. And what I'm doing here is just like emulating what data would look like. Because if you pull data from a data collection, if you had a table that had like 12 columns, each of these curly bracket objects would have 12 key value pairs. In this case, if this was real, I would have a column called name. The first entry would have the value Drew. The second one would have the value Mark. That's just how this stuff kind of works. So you don't really need to know that, but it's good to know because that, in this case, under default data, I wanted to show something in this preview here. So I was able to just pop in, I knew I was doing 3 objects. And again, like if I wanted to have 4 in there, I could just change that to 4. But I'm gonna pull that in from Airtable later. So normally if I were building, I wouldn't even change that value. I would have just moved on. It's just I wanted to show this. So that's why I did that. And then I think before I go on, just so it's wrapped up nicely, you can see I've got a column gap but no row gap. So we'll just pop a row gap in there just so it's done. And it's very similar. Instead of grid template columns, I'll be doing grid template rows and 2 rem. And actually, I bet you there's one that's just grid gap. Oh, whoops. Sorry, this is a totally wrong property. Instead of grid column gap, I want grid rows gap. Grid row gap. And like I was saying, there might be like a shorthand to do both those. I don't know, to be honest. That's that. This is this. And we're good. All right, so now that that's in place, I'm not going to worry about too much more, the actual data. I'm going to style the cards. And just for fun, just to see them better, I'm going to put 6 of them in there. All right. And then we'll go here to this actual card next, and we'll start designing it. So let's see. So I have a couple choices. Normally, if you're designing from a design file, you know, you're like referencing a design and converting it into styles. So I might look at a background color, see the value, I can know what to write, that kind of thing. And maybe I'll do that with this, but also because I already have this coded, I can go into here and inspect. And I'll just see what this looks like now. Oh, I forgot I have those animations. I have a lot to pull over. So yeah, so I can get a bunch of properties here. Like you can see this box shadow property, for example, is decently complex with 2 box shadows, and also it changes on hover and all these other things. There's a lot of properties. So what I could do to save myself time is just select these all in this inspect and paste them into the CSS right here. Right here. That would work great. And I actually wanted to do that in this demo. I'll try to do that at least for something, because I think that's a really beneficial thing as far as you see something you like on a different site, or maybe a site you made, maybe a site you didn't make. But you see something you like, you inspect it, you copy that CSS and you paste it right in a builder. And not only does it, not only you get the CSS that you want, but then once it's in here, you can switch back to used props or all props and like see it how you're used to seeing it with those GUI, you know, interfaces. So it's really cool. It's a great way to reverse engineer and actually learn CSS. And then, so yeah, so that's an option to pull CSS. But then the other option I have is to actually go into the code, because I wrote the code originally and I have it, and I can pull it in there. The code is written in SCSS and SAS, so it's going to be harder to copy and paste. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start with some of these, and then I'll do like that animation and stuff, because the animation's a little different. There's a great way to do animation in Builder, but there's no CSS animation built into the actual interface, but we do it with page headers, like I mentioned before. So it's a great workaround and works just as well. I mean, it's the same thing as if it was a built-in thing. So yeah, I'll do the animation last, which is probably actually when that loads, I think. You'll see a little pulse. Yeah, that little pulse. All right, so let's just start this. Let's just drop a few on and see what happens. So I know I have here, and you can see I called this card, this class up here. Come on, what's going on? There we go. I called this card right here, and also as a class of visible. But I'm gonna take, I don't need that animation class right now. I'll take these. Oops. I grabbed a little too much, but I'm going to keep that anyway because I need it. And then I'm going to go, and like I said, I'll go to the card element. Now this container, so this page is called card. This outside container has a primary style class of card, but when I look at it here, it's not super obvious to me. Even though I just made it, it's not super obvious. I'm actually going to change the element name to card here. That way I know every time, like, okay, like this is the card. So card primary class, and let's go to CSS. We'll paste. I pasted some extra stuff if you remember, so I'll remove that. What I did there is I highlighted that all, and I held shift and pressed tab, which back tabbed everything. Totally does not matter. You could do it line by line or leave it, but you know, as a OCD person, I just did that. So let's just look at these and make sure they're all good. All right, cool. And then in the CSS, you do have to actually hit save CSS changes. When you edit CSS or JavaScript, you need to save usually, whereas other stuff, everything saves automatically. All right, so I added these properties, and you can see them here. You can see it translated them to this visual deal. But if you look over here, something's a little wrong already. And this comes from, I'm converting it from Flexbox on the live site to grid on this. So in Flexbox, I actually had to put the width in there, and on grid, I don't need to put the width. The width is 100% of that grid block. So I'll just find the width here and take it off. So I have 33% minus 2M in a calc. Calc is like a really awesome, useful CSS thing, which if you don't know what it is, you can take two values that are different units and create a CSS value in real time. So you can say something like 33% minus 2m. Normally, if you had like, 5m minus 2m in CSS, you would just write it as 3m, but you can't do a percentage of the, minus an m, whatever, unless you use calc. So it's really cool. And in Builder, instead of selecting a unit, you actually can select calc in here somewhere. There it is. And that's how you would write that. And the only quirk that I don't even know if it's true in Builder, but I assume it is, you need a space around the operator. A little CSS quirk. Anyway, I don't need this width, so I'm going to remove it. You see now that's full. And then remember, I had that margin on for the spacing that I also don't need now. So I'm going to remove that margin. So now it's full screen or full whatever. And then the only last thing I'm going to do, which you might not even realize to do at first, is I'm going to remove the page body class or page body style that's on this card page. And I only know it's there because I know Builder, and I don't know if it'll always be there in the future. This might go away, I'm not sure, but it's got this, and I don't need it. Page body, the way I use it, I think I created my own on Monday called like body class no code list. It's the same thing as the page body style, same purpose. I use them on my page, like my root pages that have URLs, but because it does things for the browser, but I don't want it on a page over here where it's getting put into another page. So that actually had a background of white on it that we were seeing earlier, and I removed it. Now I put the background of white back because it was in this card class, but so one thing that's interesting, let's see where I am. Oh, never mind. That's just a regular shadow. Oh, I see. It's on hover off. So you can see that shadow there. One thing that's interesting here is the way that I styled no code list is, you might think when you do a box shadow or a shadow on an element that it's like a black or gray transparent shadow, and that's all it is. But actually, just like a quirky little design tip, this is actually what colors my shadows are on the no code list. There's a shadow on top that's lighter, a shadow on the bottom that's darker. And it's hard to tell, but that's what it looks like here, because remember, it's on that yellow background. So you can see it changes when you hover over it too. So that's like a little tip. You can barely see that white highlight up here, but you would notice the difference side by side if I removed it. So it's just kind of interesting. Nothing to it there, but that's that. That's the card itself. Let's check out how it looks in here. So it's starting to look good. I can see something going on with the corners here, which I'll address in a second, but you can see it's starting to match, which is cool. Let's figure out those corners. I think actually it might have kept the page body style on it, if I had to guess, because the corners aren't there here. So if I did, there's a bug with refreshing page body styles. I wonder if I just came across it live. I probably did. What I'm doing now, if you're curious, is clearing out the browser level cache, which essentially loads the page as if it were from scratch, and you can see that did fix it. So now those are matching much nicer to here. And let's see. So we can probably go right into the content on these, I think. Now that'll make the most sense. So I wrote software names so we can see these, but now we can actually see them because they're white blocks and they have shadow and they're spaced out. So now let's populate what this really will be. And I'm going to start with some kind of like dummy stuff. But what I need is an image. I need a title or a name. I have a description. This link here is the actual URL to their software. And then below, there's a section where, depending on what you're viewing, they have other stuff in them. So I've got, if there's no endorsements, there's a message to endorse it. Below, this isn't actually connected, but might as well mention, if I have an affiliate link, that goes below. But really, this section where if they don't have endorsement looks like this. If they do have an endorsement, it'll list it. If any stacks use the project, I have that stacks list of projects that use no code. If any stacks use it, it comes up here. I think there might be one other one that comes up in there sometimes. But either way, I'm going to set up a dummy card. So I'm just going to put all of those in for each one just so we can see how it looks. So the way that I would build something like this, you have a couple options with HTML. And again, HTML stuff, not necessarily builder stuff. But I would do some kind of grid or flexbox. Well, let's see. I would probably do flexbox in this case because I have a lot of side-by-side things and I want to make it, pretty quick to build up and then pretty quick to when the browser shrinks. Maybe I want to stack some of this stuff or rearrange it. I can do that really easily with flexbox. I could use grid like I used for some of the other stuff. I used grid for the columns, but if I use grid for in here, grid actually has to be literally a grid, whereas flexbox can have different widths in each row. I don't know how else to describe that. So if I made this a grid, it wouldn't work because it would have to be a small grid for the image and then a bigger one for the name. And I wouldn't be able to do this next line as just one big one. I mean, there's ways to, but it's not intuitive. So I'm going to use flexbox. I'm going to put a div inside of this card and just do flexbox and just set everything up that way. That's what I'm thinking. We'll see, because the other way to do it is you can do each row individually. So maybe I'll do a grid row here, like a div with its own grid here, a div here, which doesn't even need a grid, div here. Yeah, maybe I'll do that actually, because I really only need, it's really just this top one. So I'll do that. Forget everything I said before. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the sections basically. And this is kind of similar I was talking about on this main page, how I set up like sections. Like this is like a header. This is a section for the search. It's a section for the main, those vertical blocks. I'll just do that within the card, but they're not sections when they're inside the card because they're not page level. So I'm just adding containers, which in my head is pronounced div. I was like always think because that's what a container is, just a div in the HTML. Container is much more a human way to say it. But I'll do a container and I'll remove this class. So right now it's just a blank div. So this one will have the software name, this top one, and the logo. And that logo, I'll just put a placeholder image in there for now. Remove this value. I don't know, maybe there's something default just so we can view it. Maybe there's not though. Yeah, so I'll just do this as the default. And that looks crazy, and you can see even this one's like putting these huge ones out on the page. But we'll fix that in a second. That's fine. Then I'm gonna need another container, and this would be like for the description. In here. Remove this. And the description, we'll do a paragraph. Pop that in there. And what I'll do too is as I'm going through these, I'll name them so they're easier to use. So this is container description, and this is container image and title. Then we have, I don't know what you call these, like the extras. That's what we'll call it for now. And then the affiliates container. And then there's also one I didn't mention, but there's one down here that lists the category. So I'll do container category. All right. So that's laid out. It looks a little crazy, but as soon as I shrink this down, it'll be fine. And so this is also another good example of when I would use an inline property. Like I'm not really thinking about this image yet and what I'm going to do with it. I don't know what class, I don't know anything, but I want it smaller for my visual sanity. So I can just come in on the inline and just give it a max width of like 20 pixels, something small. Oh, that's a little small, but on the site itself, it's pretty small. Okay. Whoops. So we can see that now at least. And I forgot to take these container classes off. The other thing is when I do this, if I were going a little faster, and not explaining every step, I might drop a container, remove the style, duplicate, 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 duplicate as many as I need, and then go change the names. That's why I kind of forgot to go back in. But anyway, yeah, we're good there. You can see like each of those cards, how this page is represented in each of these, which is represented, or is, I don't know what you call it, not really represented, but which comes from this JSON. In this case, it's this one. And it looks like this. And then the description is not really that long. So this is another good thing to mention too, general building thing. But when you load data, it takes a second to load, right? Like the site loads up, but then it's pulling in data from a database, and there's tiny, tiny delays that are noticeable to the human eye, though. So you basically need to handle your placeholders, or sometimes, well, it's not really a blank slate, but sometimes people call it blank slate, where it's like you kind of have to handle like what a card would look like with no information in it. So what I do, actually, I can, in the no code list, you can see if you watch closely, when this first loads, there's just gray bars instead of any text. And that's because I haven't loaded that data in from Airtable. See that? It's actually pretty long there. So when no code list the site loads, it turns yellow and starts loading, and then it makes a call to Airtable, and then it has to wait for Airtable to send data back. So during that time, I put those bars up, because if I didn't, it would look crazy. Like you would think, what is the site doing? Is it broken? It would seem like it's loading for so long, even though it's quick. And adding those little placeholders helps a lot. So what I do a lot of times is either I'll do those bars, or I'll do like something that kind of matches what it will look like. So I don't know if I'll keep this, but if I wrote this as a description instead here, that's going to match. The descriptions are normally like one line, so it's just going to look a little nicer. And then same with the others. I didn't fill in placeholders for the other ones yet, but I would, I might write like endorse this tool or whatever. And before this goes live, I will definitely address the placeholders and have them like match as closely as I can, or use the bars or something, because it is a really important visual cue for people. And there's really no way to get around calling to a third-party service and waiting. I mean, you just need to handle it in a different way. You're never going to make that fast enough. So yeah, it's actually getting almost to an hour, which is crazy. I thought I'd be a little further through, but I'll line this up a little and get this set up. And then I guess next time we can dive much further into the specific like fonts and sizes and spacing and that kind of thing. And then it'll give me a good chance to spend some time on that animation, which would be an awesome thing to show. Because really what that is, that's a CSS animation. So it applies to anything, anytime you want to do a CSS animation. And then in addition, I'll do the hover states of this, which is actually really complex. This is all CSS. I don't even know if I could show this or remember the details, but basically if you look now, it looks like all these cards are raised up a little bit because I'm hovered over none of them. But when I hover over one, it stays up, and all the other cards push back. They go down a little bit. So if I hover over a different one, it kind of looks like they're hovering, they're subtly moving up and down. And when I hover off, they all kind of move up. That's actually decently complex CSS, but it's all CSS, no JavaScript. So I'll go over that. We can set that all up too. That'll be pretty fun. But for today, I'm gonna put this image and title side by side, and then I'll add in a couple other placeholders and call it a day, I think. So if you remember, back at the card, we've got these containers. And on the image and title container, because I want them side by side, I'm gonna have this be a grid element. And so I'm doing this on the inline styles to start, but I'm gonna move this to a class later, I'm sure. I'm not, if these never stack, if they always stay side by side, there's no real reason for me to move this into a class. The reasons are, if it's gonna change at all for responsive, it has to be in a class. And then the other important reason is if you're working with other people, it's like, I mean, it's super frustrating when you're working on someone else's code and there's just all these inline style. Like it's just a very kind of a hacky way to write, even though it's totally legit, hacky way to build. So I try not to do it, but in this case, I mean, this is my site, no one works on it, and even if they did, this is pretty minor. So if these never stack, I might actually just keep this forever this way. We'll see. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna see the general size of one of these images. These images, I'm pretty sure, don't have anything constraining their size. Oh, maybe they have a height constraining their size. But I think it's like a weird way, and I create each of these images myself. That's why they're all like standard square and no text in them kind of thing, which is so annoying. But because I do that, I just format them correctly. For this new site, I'm gonna make this easier on myself. So it looks like I'm just trying to see where I have something. Okay, so I can see here I have a max height of 1.75 m on the image, max width of 100%, and then a margin right. So if I take this height off, that's where they would look more. Yeah, okay. So a height of 1.75 m, and they're kind of generally square. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the column width, I'll do 1.75 m, and then I'll do a 0.5 column gap. And that should match this pretty nicely. So 1.75 m, and remember I do the image size here, 1.75 m, and then one fractional width for all the rest. It just fills up the remaining space. And then grid column gap of 0.5 m. Okay, and now this looks a little wild. I'm not sure what's going on there, but we'll figure it out. It might be this image has some properties on it. Not really. Let's see what it looks like live. That's very interesting. I think the image itself, oh, I forgot I put this max width 60 on it. I think the image itself might just be popping out because it doesn't constrain the width, maybe. There we go. Yeah, so this, and I would, you know, I'm gonna stop before I get this today, but I would address this like in a second normally. Basically, this image class itself doesn't have anything on it for a width. Well, it has object fit on it, but that's not the same thing. So for me, when I design, I make all my widths 100%. Like that's just the thing. So like I would actually I'll create my own primary class for images, and I'll make that width 100%, which is a responsive thing. And then I control other ways, like with max width or with its containers width will contain it, that kind of thing, or control it. So in this case, that didn't have a width. Just putting a width on this inline of 100% fixed it. I'll move that to a class later. And so now this should be good. And hopefully I'll have that little gap too. Yeah. All right, so we're good. And actually in real life, I'm going to make that a little bigger. That looks pretty small. I can do that now. And I'm controlling, so the width, the image is 100%, but the image's container, I'm controlling with this grid. The image's container is 1.75 m. In this case too, I don't know if I described this yet or not, but an m, the easiest way to think of m is like, it's very similar to percentage. What it actually stands for is the height of the character, like the letter M, like it's an old typesetting unit. But the M height is what they would call it in typesetting. M is like 1 M would be like the same font size. So if you have like a font size of 14 pixels and then you do something else and you make the font size 1M, it's going to be 14 pixels. If you make that other font size that overwrites it 2M, it's going to make it 28 pixels. It doubles it, 2M. 1.5M would be 21 pixels. And that's how M's work. And I did mention at least something about them originally on Monday because I set up my base font size to be like 14 pixels, and then I can set M's for everything else, and everything else scales proportionally. That's kind of where this comes from. I almost never do an M in a case like this, actually. Like that came from how it was on the last site. In this case, I would actually do rem. And the difference between rem and M, rem is always, well, yeah, M is always relative to to the base level, like the body. If I have a 14 pixel on my body class, that rem is always going to mean 14 pixels. So 2 rem is always 28. M is relative to its parent. So if you had a 14 pixel on the body and then a 2M, so it jumped it up to 28, but then you had something else on top of that that was like 3M. That'd actually be like 28 times 3. So sorry if there's a lot of confusing numbers, but the point is, relative M, you're more sure of what that size is going to be. So if I set something to 14 pixels on the body class, and then I set a relative M 1.75. Actually, I don't know if the R stands for relative. I shouldn't say that. I think it doesn't. Anyway, if I said 1.75 rem, I always know it's going to be 14 like times 1.75. That's going to be my value. Whereas M, I wouldn't know, because if that's in a container that already has the M changed, it's going to change it. I feel like that was really confusing after I said it. Hopefully not, but point is, rems and Ms are super useful. I use them all the time, but it does sort of matter what you use them for. And the quick cheat sheet for me is like fonts. I'm using Ms, padding, margin, widths, whatever. Unless I specifically want it proportional to the font, I'm almost always using rem, because that'll keep my layout the same. The one exception would be if I have padding like around, say I have like a heading and I want padding around it, I might use rem for that, so that if the heading's like extra big, the padding's also proportionally extra big. Anyway, that's a tangent. I don't think that's super necessary to go into all that. What I was about to do was change this width so that the image gets a little bigger, and then I'm gonna just put it for 2 for now. I'll finesse this maybe later. And then I'm just gonna pop some defaults in for these other things. So this would be, let's see. These are basically text, these other ones. So I'll just duplicate this and put it here. And this would be like, and I'll definitely change, I mean, I wouldn't go live with saying this is a this is a that, but you know. So last time I duplicated, this time I clicked copy, I go in here and click paste. Just different ways you can do things. I found that I more often am copying and pasting than dragging new elements in, just because all your classes and stuff are already on them, and it's just, you know. And then categories, that's going to get its own special styling, but we'll do that next time. All right. I just want to do that so we're set up. So here's what we got to today. Perfect. A little over an hour. Pretty good though, because you can see, like, in general, we're pretty far. I mean, like, the no-code list is not a complex site visually, but we're getting there. Definitely a few key styles that'll make it really pop into place, like a few small things, and then a couple of details, like, and like I was talking about, the animations and hovers on here will be a little bit advanced, but we're really close, so it's pretty cool. Next time we'll finish styling these with the complex stuff, and then and maybe I'll even style this search bar too, I don't know. And then we'll pull in that Airtable data, which I'm really excited about. The Airtable data, I have one action that pulls in the data, and then I have another action that will take one of the columns from the data and pull it into like a category list. So I'm really looking forward to it, because I think the functionality of this is going to pop up in like 2 seconds. But we'll see, because it's actually, you know, a live demo, and I haven't done it much with the pattern, so you never know. But yeah, I think that's good for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'm glad some people actually came back. I'll do this again on Friday at 1. Next week, I'll do it on Monday and Wednesday at 1. And Friday, I definitely will not be live streaming, because I'll be out of the office on Friday. But I'll mention that later. So yeah, thanks for watching again. I'm going to end it now, and tune in on Friday, 1 Austin time, 7 Greenwich Mean Time.